are you listening to? Straight Talk with Kim and Carolyn.
Welcome to Straight Talk with Kim and Carolyn. I'm Kim.
And I'm Carolyn.
Okay, we have scary things going on right now on the economics front. So some big things that have been happening. And so...
Yeah, all over the place, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So we're going to be talking a little bit about the White House's denial that we are in a recession. Like, is there anything that this White House doesn't just redefine? Because
right, and literally on the fly on the internet, right? I saw postings. In fact, I did screenshot a tweet that somebody had of Merriam-Webster changing the definition of recession.
Oh my gosh! But Wikipedia, I take that back. Merriam-Webster may have, Wikipedia did for sure, but there were some other definitions that Merriam-Webster did. Yeah. And also, is there anything from 1984, Orwell's 1984, that hasn't also come
my
true?
gosh.
So tonight we have one of the state's leading economists and serves currently in the Utah House of Representatives,
yes.
and Robert Spendlove.
And somebody we really like, because how can you not love Representative Spendlove?
And, you know, people tease him about his name sometimes, but he's one of our, kind of fiscal watchdogs that we have in the Utah House, and knows his stuff. And what he was a go-to for me on a lot of the economic policies, especially he would frequently scare me to death on, look at the way some things are going. But, the fact that some things can also be fairly predicted or, cyclical. And there he is. He knows something. So he kind of knew a little bit about how things might be today.
And he is House Vice Chair on Executive Appropriations. And for those who just have no idea what the Appropriations Committee does, they spend all your money.
That's right. So, all right. Well, let's welcome Robert Spendlove.
Well, it's great to be with you guys.
So today we all woke up to learning, to our shock and surprise, that we are in a recession. And then about an hour later, the White House announced, no, we're not. We're really not, because we changed the definitions. So,
but they did say that we could know after midterms. I think it was timing something like that. Then we'll know if we had been in a recession.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, okay. So, Robert, Representative, what is the state of Utah's economy in relation to things like inflation?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think inflation, people are feeling the inflation pinch everywhere they turn. And I think that's probably at the top of people's minds when it comes to economics within their own home, and then they look at the government and the things that the government is doing. So, I just wanted to make sure. Inflation, I think, is probably our number one concern as consumers right now.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I'm an economist that is not going to sit here and explain to you why this is not a recession. You just talk to the average person on the street, and they say, we don't feel good about the economy. Consumer confidence is way down. The expectations of how the economy is going to do is down. People just don't feel good right now. And, even if you say, 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP isn't a recession, you talk to the average person, they're like, we don't believe you.
I don't care what you call it either, right? I mean, that's one of the things they say. I don't care what you call it. Feels like a recession.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and people know they just don't feel good. And so what they're looking at is what you just said, that inflation. Our latest inflation numbers came in above 9%. It's the highest inflation that we've seen in 40 years. And not only is it up, but it keeps surprising to the upside. So we call them false peaks, where you have a peak and then it looks like it's coming down and it accelerates again. We've had 2 of those already this year. And so, we don't really know if or when that inflation will peak either. And that gets people really nervous, because you're like, well, I may have gotten a raise from work, but the cost of my gas or the cost of my groceries continues to go up and eat up any benefit that I get from wage increases. And so they call inflation the most regressive tax because it really hits low income and people with fixed incomes especially hard. Walmart just this week announced, essentially their stock dropped 8% because they had a warning about their earnings. And what was really interesting is when you dig in, what they said is consumers are continuing to spend like they were before, but what they're spending their money on is changing. Mm-hmm. So they used to be buying big ticket items like TVs and washers and dryers. Now what are they buying their money? Food and essentials, because that's all they can afford anymore. You can't buy those extra fun stuff anymore because all of your money is being eaten up by those essential items.
So recently, it was reported that Utah's experience is that the average Utahn is paying somewhere around $400 a month extra, $5,000 a year extra due to inflation. What are you seeing from your vantage point?
Yeah, so now we don't have Utah specific data, but we have kind of our region. And so while the national inflation is 9%, our regional inflation is 10%. So we're seeing even tougher markets right now. Food prices are higher than the national average. Housing price inflation is above the national average. Energy prices are above the national average. So really, everywhere where you see inflation at the national level, we're seeing it even worse locally.
So tell us, each month we hear about rising inflation and the numbers keep increasing, escalating every single month. Tell us as an economist so that we all understand that is, I think last month or the month prior was 8% something, right? And then it was 9.1 maybe, if I remember correctly. I haven't looked this up recently. Yep. But that is not each month, that's year over year from the previous month, correct?
Yes.
So talk to us about how those numbers work. So what is that then cumulatively, and how and when do they figure that?
Yeah, so that comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they figure both a month over month change and then a year over year change.
Okay.
And so one of the theories, I mean, if you kind of think back a year ago, do you remember what the Fed and the national economists were calling this inflation? Right? They called it transitory. They said and transitory is just a fancy word for temporary. And they said, okay, you don't need to worry about this inflation. It's going to be temporary, and it's just limited to used cars. And, it's going to go away on its own when the supply chain fixes itself. And, and then we started to hear that a little bit in the spring. They said, well, once we start to have the base effects, which means when you're building off a higher base, that number should come down. And they said, well, we're going to have base effects, and we're going to see those numbers come down. And what we've seen over the last year and a half, over the last 18 months, is that year over year number keeps building on itself. So we're building off a higher base, and that number keeps accelerating. The really scary thing that, and I don't know if you want to get into the Federal Reserve's response, but what really has the Fed spooked is expectations of future inflation. So they go out. The University of Michigan has a consumer confidence survey, and so they say, how do you feel about the economy? Came in at the lowest level they've ever measured. Wow. In the 50 years they've been collecting this data. And then the next question they say is, how high do you expect inflation to be a year from now? And came in at over 5%. So the problem there is if people expect inflation to be high a year from now or in the future, it will be, because they start changing their activities to account for this expectation. And that's what can build on itself and turn into the kind of inflation that we saw in the 1970s. So that's what really has the Fed spooked right now.
So, and based on what you just said too, right, about the base increasing, if we see 5% inflation a year from now, that's on top of the over 9% inflation that we just experienced. Right?
Exactly.
So in a 2-year period, you're talking 14% plus
Yeah.
inflation.
And so one of the big fears is that so we see wages going up too. Wages are going up around 5% a year. So there's two problems with this. Even at 5% wage increases, it's still a real loss. When you look on an inflation adjusted basis, people aren't keeping up with that inflation. But then the second thing is, even if they do, we call it a wage price spiral, where wages increase to account for the increase in inflation, and then employers have to raise their prices to cover the cost of the increased wages, and it just keeps building on itself, and starts to get out of control. And so again, that's what we're trying to prevent from happening. We've got to slow down both the inflation and these crazy wage increases. But you can't just slow down the wage increases and keep that high inflation.
That's right. That's right. So when you say that's what we have to control, how is that controlled? So we just, we see the federal government responding to this. We're looking at the Fed adjusting interest rates to try to harness some of this and slow it down. But the real solid answer is to go ahead and tax more during an inflationary period like this and during a recession. So that's Congress's answer currently. And my school district, it's also their answer because they don't have, they are strapped right now. So they need more of my money. And Jordan School District, for instance, is raising our taxes 26.3% because they really need it. And we have pockets. They just have to dig deeper. So really, what is maybe a governmental response that might actually help, and what are the things that hurt?
Well, and the other governmental response is what you see in California, which is they're just sending more money out, which just makes the problem worse. The reason we got into this mess is because the federal government essentially dropped $4 trillion on all of us and said, guys, have fun. And, when you create that much new money, when you just throw money at a problem, it creates inflation. And when you throw $4 trillion at a problem, it creates out of control inflation.
Now, some of us knew that, though, right? Like some of us already understood that.
Yeah, but
and we can tell you so.
But let's be honest, though. It's just like everything in life. We've gotten away with it for decades, this type of behavior, right? And so to the average consumer or the proponent of MMT, which I think this is, modern monetary theory, and their solution always is increase taxes and pull that money back out of the economy. But, for those who believe that or just don't, or just believe what they've seen right in front of their eyes, which is, we've been dumping money. The Fed has been dumping money into the economy for decades. And a whole lot of us warned about this in 2009 and 2010. Well, just like everything, it's the cumulative impact. And it turns out there was a whole lot of money, many trillions of dollars, it seems to happen to be, that were off book, that were printed during that time and sent around the world. And you have cumulative impacts, and things are only good for so long. Right? At some point, you can't control any longer. What can the Fed do at this point to really pull back and get control of the situation without killing the average American?
So, the problem is the Fed and Congress fundamentally messed up, and they created a situation where the Federal Reserve at this point only really has that one tool. They really have two tools. But it's interest rates and it's their balance sheet, and all they can. So if you kind of think about economics, there's supply and there's demand, right? the Federal Reserve Bank can't affect supply. They can only affect demand. So what they're going to do is they're going to just raise interest rates so much that it depresses demand, and people, and you already see this happening in the housing market,
Right.
where housing prices are starting to come down, and it's because the Fed has raised interest rates so much that it's making houses more expensive. Now, I think the true solution, though, is we've got to fix the supply side. And the way you fix the supply side is we've got to get people producing more things. And you do that through regulatory reform. You do that by getting government out of the business of telling private enterprises what to do. I was just talking to a rancher in rural Utah just this afternoon, and he said the federal government tells him how much he has to pay his workers. They tell him, what hours he's allowed to work as workers. I mean, they're becoming so entrenched in telling businesses everything that they're supposed to do, and it makes it impossible to operate.
The other thing we're seeing too that is also highly, highly troublesome is when the free market is no longer a free market, when it is so absolutely skewed in favor of some entities. For instance, a lot of states now and even the federal government are looking at is it reasonable to restrict foreign entities, especially foreign entities that are on the threat list, from coming in and buying hundreds of acres of it in our own state, where China-related entities came in and bought one of our largest pork-producing ranches, and then turned it into something else. And so then you shut it down, and then you start having those kinds of non-free market things start affecting prices, availability, the supply side. And so we're kind of all over the place on free market because it's not so free in so many ways. And we're no longer, as a country, really, in some ways, looking out for our own citizens and our own national interests when we allow things like that, when we allow the free market to be so disrupted and no longer free.
And let me add one thing to that, because I had a conversation with somebody the other day who imports a lot of product from China. And I said, and supply chains, I talked to him the end of last year. He was having trouble getting a lot of things into the country. It's more back to normal. The biggest issue right now is California ports. So it comes across the ocean pretty well and then gets stuck in California ports, but still substantially better than it was the end of last year. And I asked him, I said, have you looked at manufacturing within the United States? And here we have a competitor that is not free market, right? We know that there are slaves doing some of the work in China. And he said, the fact of the matter is, when it comes right down to it, and 5 times the cost to manufacture in the U.S. There are a couple of other issues, but the main one is 5 times the cost for a lot of his products. And that includes, that's with him already adding in the cost of shipping and clearing through ports. And so we have some regulatory reforms, like you mentioned, Representative, that need to take place. But again, it came to me that we're not going to solve that problem until our government takes some action, because again, this isn't a free market. If you want to say that slave labor is the equivalent of what we have going on here, and we should allow them to compete with our own producers in the same way, I have an argument to
and that's
make
one
with
of the
that,
I mean
right?
That's one of those perennial questions about tariffs and things like that. But Utah really does. Utah's made a lot of strides, and I know Representative Spendlove has been on the side of deregulating and trying to remove some of those barriers to competition and barriers to market entry and things like that. I wanted to ask you again, what is the economic principle behind raising taxes during a non-recession, during this recession, where I have a school district, my school district wants to raise our taxes 26.3%.
I don't think there's a tax fundamental policy that is consistent with that. I think it's just a matter of wanting more revenue.
Yeah, and at a time when Yeah, we don't have it. We've all lost revenue, but the district wants to recoup some more revenue.
Well, and it's the same thing we're seeing with the federal government right now, right?
Raising
Yeah, and what's interesting is that these tax policies actually have, and you already know this, but it's true in economics. We call it deadweight loss. It actually has a negative impact on economic growth through the tax policy. The purpose of taxes is to fund the government programs that we absolutely need. But there needs to be an appropriate level. It needs to be as small as possible and just enough to maintain those necessary services. But so often we use taxes as a way to influence people or to punish people or to try to redistribute the wealth. And it causes this deadweight loss, and it increases the inefficiency and hurts the economy.
Well, and you're the guy that is shepherding a lot of that collective political will of 75 people, and down the hall another 29 people that want to say how our money's spent. But so send your emails to Robert.Spendlove or
Spendlove@le.utah.gov.
If you're wondering about how some of this money is being spent, because we heard him say essential, the primary essential services of government. I heard
That's true. That's true. He did say that.
Or the necessary. I can't remember.
Like police, fire, things like that are I think everyone would argue is essential. Having economic development giveaways to businesses, maybe not so much.
Oh, that's nice. That's nice to hear.
But I do think that's where, I think we're reaching, coming to a head on a number of issues societally as we're seeing things escalate and crash and burn, or come close to the crash and burn, right? And I think that we have to be asking questions like exactly what you posed, Representative, and that is, what is the purpose of government? What are those essential services that we need and we expect collectively our government to provide for us that we are unable to do, or that private industry is unable to do for us? But that requires us to be asking some of these questions. And I think that, I've said to people repeatedly when it comes to the education issue, as we talk about what's appropriate in education, my first response always is, we cannot even have a discussion about education until we go back to the fundamental question and can agree on the answer to this question of what is the purpose of education in a free society? What is the purpose of taxpayer funded and provided?
And that's
education?
everything. I mean, that comes down to our social services and everything like that. So Representative Spendlove, you're one of the go-to guys on helping us understand cycles and how, what we might be able to rely on in an outlook, but kind of some of that's out the window. But can you give us hope or tell us what to bury in a bunker, or what do we need to know?
So here's a positive. One of the struggles that people run into is right now we're hearing this, is people are worried that if we are in a recession, honestly, we really don't know. It feels like it to me, and I think a lot of people feel like it is, but we don't have all the data to know for sure. But let's just say that we are. People always assume that it's going to be like the last recession. And we will never see a recession like the last one in our lifetimes. I mean, the one in 2020, we lost 22 million jobs in 2 months. GDP contracted by 30% in 1 quarter. And we're just not going to see that again. And I think part of it is people are not going to be willing to allow the government to shut down the economy like they did in 2020. So that's just not going to happen again. So then you go back to, what about the recession before that? Well, the one before that was the Great Recession. And, where we had this dramatic collapse in the housing market. We had a jobless recovery for years and years. Mm-hmm. I don't see it being as bad as that one either. I think the best recession analogy that I think we're going to see this time is something like the 0102 recession, a relatively mild recession. We will see unemployment rate go up. We will see, businesses, struggle, and we're already starting to see that with a lot of the tech sector and some of the larger businesses. But I don't think it's going to be a dramatic collapse like we saw 2 years ago, or even that really bad recession like we saw in 0809.
So tell us one last question, and maybe that should have been the last question, but one last question. From where you sit on the Appropriations Committee, what is have you guys had any presentations or updates at this point on what the state's seeing, what the pressures are and will be over the coming year on the state for increased services and increased costs of those services?
Yeah, so the state, just like any family or just like any business, is struggling with these inflationary pressures, is struggling with these wage pressures. But one of the messages that I'm telling, not only state government but local, is we need to be prepared for some difficult decisions. We need to be prepared for, if households are seeing tougher times, then the state should be preparing for that as well. And we need to be living within our means. We need to be assessing areas where we can reduce or cut back, and be preparing for the potential for difficult times.
Well, and the fact that Utah really has repeatedly year after year, best economic outlook, things like that. We've done smart things economically, rainy day funds, not overextending, things like that. So we're probably in a better position than a lot of other states, but yeah.
We are.
So thank you for your leadership on the economics in the legislature, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. It was great to be with you.
So, yeah, I think that everyone's feeling the pressure. I saw something today where somebody said that just a few years ago, I want to say in 2019, that Jordan School District increased or had a tax increase at that point. I don't know if that's correct, but just a few years ago. And they were just curious where all that money went, because they're asking for a significant one yet again.
There is just a pattern of poor management in the school district. But what's really funny to me is to watch district employees really argue, but we need it. But we really need it.
Yeah.
But we really need it.
Yeah.
And we need it more. So
it seems to me like there should probably be a budget laid out. Is there?
Well, yeah, there's a budget.
And a budget that includes like what these increased taxes will go to cover. Why they need it? Do you get that in a Truth and Taxation hearing? I've never attended one.
Okay, so if you look at my Facebook from this week, I did attend the Jordan School District work session yesterday, day before, so that they discussed whether or not they should present to the public in the Truth and Taxation Committee, and that list, why we're doing it, what they're doing, where the money's gone, where plans to go to. So FOSMU has a question.
Yeah.
Well, I thought that Representative Spendlove's prediction, as it were, was pretty positive, as long as nothing unexpected happens. But what happens if the president declares a climate or public health emergency? And does that throw all that somewhat optimistic outlook out the window, or what happens then?
I don't know. All of that's super frightening. I mean,
I don't know. I
think
trust my government.
No,
so.
we failed the COVID dress rehearsal, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so.
Haven't I said I had a discussion with somebody in the executive branch just the end of last year, and when I got excuses over why they were going to allow the federal government to force medical procedures on unwilling participants, I asked the question, or made the statement or something, you do understand. If and when a climate emergency is declared, this is where they will go with it. And the response that I got was, oh, that's rather extreme. Yeah, it is. They're on their way there right now.
Yeah. And, we showed that we will go right along with it.
Some of us.
Yeah. So, and some of us told you so 2 years ago. You can't shut down businesses because, there are going to be consequences down the road. And so now we're reaping those consequences.
But again, there haven't been consequences for a whole long time and for a whole lot of people, right?
But there are now.
There are
coming
now.
Home,
Yeah.
So.
Yep.
All right.
Yeah. So thank you for joining us for another episode of Straight Talk with Kim and Carolyn. You breathed. I thought you wanted to say something.
No,
okay.
breathe.
Anyway, so we'd like to thank our producer, Fosmu.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're trying new angles with the cameras, and Fosmu actually had things all set up for us when we came to the studio today. So thank you very much for your creative work. And please like us, follow us, share with your friends, listen to us every single time we put out an episode. We've had a lot of craziness this summer, as I'm sure you have as well. Some illness, some vacations. No, wait a minute.
Yeah, but we've got a great audience and very engaging, and so we're just
because I'm asked all the time, actually. Hey, have you guys haven't done any shows recently? So anyway, yes, follow us, share us, like us, and we will see you next time.